Welcome to Checking Your Pay, a beginner's guide to navigating your flight summary as a service director. My name is Jesse Matthews. I am one of 8 vice presidents at Local 4094 in Vancouver. Before we get started, just a quick set of disclaimers. This presentation is provided on behalf of the Education Committee at Local 4094 in Vancouver, intended without prejudice or precedent and for informational purposes only. If there is any discrepancy between this presentation and what's in our collective agreement or any applicable legislation or policies, then of course the collective agreement, legislation and or policies will take precedence over this presentation. And without further ado, let us get started. Flight summary overview. We have done this in several of the previous videos, but we will just do a quick review here before we get started with service director specific items to look for. As always, our pay is calculated using minutes and not hours. This is especially important as we get paid by aircraft type, which we will dive into a little further shortly. To convert hours to minutes, one must multiply the hours by 60 and then add the minutes after. So for example, with 2458, we have 24 for the hours. Take 24, multiply it by 60, and that will get us with 1,440 minutes. Then we take the remaining 58 minutes and add that to the 1,440 minutes. And then in total, that gets us to 1,498 minutes. To go the other way around and convert minutes into hours format, we divide the number by 60, multiply the remaining decimals by 60, and then combine them. So for example, when dividing 1,498 by 60, we get 24 hours, and then we get a decimal. In this case, the decimal is 0.96667. And to convert this into a number of minutes to be read, we take 0.96667 and multiply it by 60. That gives us a final number of 58. That would be the number of minutes to combine with the 24. So when combining 24 and 58, we get 2458 in hours minutes format. And once again, we have two major sections in our flight summary. The first one is the flight information section. This section records any of the activity we've done during the month. That could be flying, that could be airport standby. In my case, as a union rep, that can be getting released for union business. There's a number of reasons. You'll see different descriptors in your flight information section. In any case, this is the section that records your activity. On the other hand, flight duty credits, this corresponds to the flight information section in the sense that flight duty credits will explain how you are paid for the activity that is logged in the flight information section. For those of you who are watching this that happen to be flight attendants, there are situations where you're moved up to service director. And in that case, you would see in both the employee status section of the flight information area of the flight summary that there is the descriptor of SD in this column where you would normally see FA if you're regularly a flight attendant. And accordingly, over in the flight duty credit section, you will also see your status for pay purposes is service director as well. In this case, since I had become a service director in this particular month, May 2023, I am showing a status of Service Director. And so everything that I've got logged here for my activity is paid out accordingly at Service Director. So we'll go into a quick little overview here as far as what we mean for pay by aircraft type. Every aircraft that we operate has a pay rate associated with it. In our collective agreement, you can find the references to indicate what these pay rates are in Article 5.04 and Article 5.05. This is different from the flight attendant pay scale. You will see that rather than talking about levels, that on the flight attendant pay scale, the main topic of discussion is years of service. So you can see, for example, 0 to 12 months. That's where you would be at step 1 as far as where you are in the flight attendant pay scale. And it goes so on and so forth until you get to 6th year, where it becomes years as the metric of moving up on the pay scale. But otherwise it's time-based and only time-based as far as flight attendant pay is concerned. There is another pay scale referred to as the assistant purser pay scale. This one is legacy language that we inherited from previous contracts and when there were other additional positions that existed at Air Canada and Canadian Airlines and the other airlines before it. Nowadays, the assistant purser pay code is used during one's initial service director training month. And there are very limited applications beyond the scope of this video for this pay scale otherwise. The pay scale that is of relevance to us as service directors is the section that is, of course, titled Service Director. And the notable difference here is that unlike the other pay scales where we see all for the equipment, we instead see that there are specific aircraft types. We have the Embraer, for example, shown as EMJ, because at the time of the writing of this language, the Embraer was still in our fleet. The Airbus 319, the 320, the Boeing 737, and the Airbus 220 are all what we would collectively consider as the narrow body pay scale. Now, what's unique for us as service directors is that it is just the narrow body aircraft where we have any sort of pay progression on a scale. This starts at level 1 and then moves on to level 2 after 1 year and finally moves on to level 3. And from there, level 3 is the top of the pay scale as far as narrow body is concerned. Other aircraft types, such as the Airbus 321, the Boeing 767, the Airbus 330, the 777, and the 787, all have just one step on their pay scales, so immediately already maxing out on potential pay per hour right from your first day of being a service director. Just a couple of quick items of note here. When you first start out as a service director, you're placed at step 1 on the pay scale unless you have 5 or more revised years of service. And in that case, you get to start at step 2. No one ever starts at step 3, but the 5-year delineator determines whether you start at step 1 or step 2. If you do fly as a flight attendant after becoming a service director, you are contractually entitled to pay at your step on the narrow body service director pay scale. And the reference for that is Article 5.12.02. Every year, a new PDF with the current pay rates is uploaded to Aeronet for easy reference. The only thing that changes at the very top is essentially the year. So for this particular video, I have the pay scale that was in effect April 1st, 2023, just because some of the examples we'll look into involve pay as of 2023. Again, as mentioned, as a service director, we are paid based on aircraft type. There is a very important note here for 777 and 787 flights. There are two potential pay rates that can be used, and this is based on whether one service director or two service directors operate that flight. For that reason, you'll want to make sure the pay rate that has been given is the correct one whenever you happen to be operating as a service director on a 777 or a 787. Essentially, what happens if you are one of two service directors on a 777 or a 787, as per the blue starred note from the rate of pay document, the 767 rate is used instead. So it's essentially just one small step down the scale. So for the rates in effect as of April 1st, 2023, that would mean making $82.25 an hour, as opposed to making $85.30 an hour. So a little bit less. But definitely something to pay attention to. For those on reserve, if your total pay minutes for the month are fewer than 4,500 minutes, there is a prorated MMG adjustment that has to be done. We're going to look into a real-world example from my own schedule. In this particular month, I had 2,668 pay minutes. And you will note that this is less than 4,500 minutes, so an adjustment was required. So for our MMG adjustment in general, we determine this by subtracting total pay minutes from basic minimum guarantee. The basic minimum guarantee is 75 hours on reserve every month by default, and in minutes this becomes 4,500. This only changes if we are off payroll for some reason during the month, and as per our contractual language, the reduction is 2 hours and 25 minutes per day off payroll. In minutes format, this is 145. So for each day off payroll, 145 minutes would be deducted from 4,500. Time off payroll includes when you are sick, personal leaves of absence, unavailable for duty, and so on and so forth. In my case, we see that I had 27 days on payroll out of the 31 possible. So we need to account for that reduction to get the new minimum monthly guarantee. Best way to do that is to take those 2 hours and 25 minutes per day, which is 145 in minutes format, multiply it by 4, since it is 4 days that I was unavailable for. And the grand total here is 580. So then the last thing to do is to subtract 580 from 4,500 and make sure that my reduced minimum guarantee is reflective of that number. And indeed, when subtracting 580 from 4,500, we get 3,920 as my reduced minimum guarantee to begin with for the month. So where did those 4 days off of payroll come from to begin with? This is something that we can find in our flight information section and our flight duty credit section combined. In this case, my time off payroll was due to personal illness. We can see that in index item number 2, that I was booked off as of May the 13th, 12:01 a.m., which is when any day on reserve starts, and that my illness finished right at midnight on the 16th, which is effectively the 17th. When looking over in the flight duty credit section at index item number 2, we can see that because I had sick days, I was paid for 4 sick days at a rate of $176.68 per day, and that gave me a total of $706.72 that I was paid for being sick on those 4 days. So as long as you have sick days, you will be paid separately in your flight duty credit section for the time spent sick. When you don't have sick days, then this doesn't happen. Either way, you will have the number of days that you are sick factored out of your minimum monthly guarantee. So how do we calculate our minimum monthly guarantee as service directors when operating multiple aircraft types? For the purpose of calculating an adjustment to minimum monthly guarantee, the Airbus 321 is considered a narrow-body aircraft. That means it is lumped in at the same pay rate in the proration formula as the Airbus 220, 319, 320, and the Boeing 737. Yes, I understand this is perplexing because we can see here in the table that there is a separate pay rate for the Airbus 321 when being paid for our flights. And indeed, if we look at an example from my flight summary, we can see that index item number 9, that it was a flight that was operated on a 321 and that there were 89 pay minutes available. We can even see when looking in the flight duty credit section that for index item 9, for 89 minutes on the Airbus 321, that I was paid at a rate of $1 and approximately 24 cents per minute operating on the Airbus 321. We can see that matches what's in the table, and that is higher than the narrow body rate. So for the flight itself, the Airbus 321 counts at a higher pay rate. But you'll notice when looking in the minimum monthly guarantee adjustment section at the different aircraft types that are factored in, that there is the 777, and then there is a category simply referred to as other, and this is really for narrow body aircraft, and then for other items such as union business or an airport standby. This is based directly on the language found in Article 5.11.01, the note specifically. And as a result, the Airbus 321 for the purpose of MMG top-up is lumped in with narrow body. Having said all of that, let us do some math now so we can verify our minimum monthly guarantee has been prorated correctly. So first, we see that I had 3,920 minutes as my reduced minimum monthly guarantee. We verified that that was correct after removing the 4 sick days and that they had been paid out correctly separately. Next, the total minutes that I flew that have already been paid for are 2,668, and that lines up with what shows in my flight information section. Finally, with a simple subtraction equation, if I subtract those 2,668 minutes from the 3,920, the adjustment I still have to be paid for is 1,252, and that is correct. So the only thing in question is how those 1,252 minutes are paid out. When we talk about proration, what we mean is that there is a ratio of what you fly as a service director in any given month. And if you're on reserve and you don't complete your minimum 75 hours, that ratio of flying needs to be used to pay your remaining unflown hours. And really what this section of minimum guarantee adjustment shows is just how that breakdown transpires, and that way we can verify that we do in fact have the ratio that should be here. So let's just start with the 777 line. We know that for any single purser aircraft, the rate in effect would be $1.42 approximately per minute. And if we look at the flight information activity that I had, that would be indexes 10 and 11. Both of these are domestic flights, Toronto to Calgary and Calgary to Toronto. These both have one service director on board, and these are both 787, which is paid at the same rate as the 777. So I should then take the pay minutes and add them up. 259 plus 231, that equals 490. And that is precisely what we see on the 777 line. So we know that that portion of the ratio is correct. If we look back at my flight information section at any remaining activity, we can see 220, 220, a whole lot of 220, 320, 220, 321, and 220. All of these, with the exception of the 321, are narrow-body aircraft. However, as mentioned before, for the purpose of the minimum monthly guarantee top-up, the 321 is considered at the narrow-body rate. So, if we add all of these minutes together, along with the 240 for that last standby of the month, we get a total of 2,178 minutes, and that lines up with what is in other, in the minimum monthly guarantee adjustment. So the ratio as far as what needs to be accounted for has been calculated correctly. The question is, what do we then do? So what we do is, now that the factors have been established, that's the ratio of flying, basically factor is the mathematical term for it. Once the factors have been established, then each factor is multiplied by the aircraft type rate of pay, and that gets you another decimal number. So for example, the first factor is 490 divided by 2,668. That is approximately 18% of the flying done in my month here. So 18% of my top-up minutes need to be paid at the 777 rate. The mathematical equivalent to make this happen is to take the 18% and to then multiply the rate per minute for 777 and 787. For all of the other flying, that's 2,178 over 2,668. That is approximately 82% of the flying that I completed in this particular block month. So the mathematical equivalent for the purpose of proration would be to take 82% and to multiply the narrow body rate of pay by that number. There is then a fractional rate per minute that each equation generates, and then that number is multiplied by the 1,252 minutes that we see on each line. So what we can do from start to finish is first take the 18% that we know is the factor here, multiply the rate of pay per minute, and then multiply the number of minutes needed in our top-up. That will get us our first number in our minimum monthly guarantee top-up, $326.88, and that was correct for this month. For all the other aircraft type, this particular factor was 82% approximately. So when multiplying that factor by the narrow body rate of pay, that created a fractional number, which could then be multiplied by the number of minutes in the top-up, and that has us arriving at $1,072.31. This too is correct based on past practice and what's in our collective agreement. These two numbers added together get us to $1,399.19. If we take what I was already paid for my flying activity, that was $3,705.26, and then add it to the top-up we've just calculated, those together get us a final pay total of $5,104.45. Let's talk about a few other service director specific items to be aware of when it comes to pay. Ground duty credits in general are paid at 1/2 of our hourly rate. In other words, paid by a factor of 50 if we use the mathematics term. And this is paid by the aircraft type operated for the flight leg associated with those claims. There are two major ground duty categorized e-claims. The first is for ground service to passengers. A lot of people call this ground duty for short, but to avoid any ambiguity, we'll refer to this as ground service to passengers, since that is what the collective agreement calls it as well. This is for water service, headset distribution to passengers, etc. And this is claimable for at least 30 minutes from the original scheduled time of departure all the way up to actual time of departure. The reference for this is Article 5.09. It's recommended to substantiate your e-claims by reporting all the ground service performed in your OBR. This can be done in the category of crew feedback, the ground duty subcategory, and then use delay. For any ground service to passengers, it can be partially or even entirely absorbed by any DPG or THG present in each crew member's duty day or pairing. If you'd like to do this manual calculation yourself, you would multiply your DPG or THG by 2, and that will give you the number of minutes that are absorbed from your e-claim. Having said that, it is best in general to file for the ground service to passengers whenever you're in doubt and allow crew pay to do the math on your behalf. Pairings can change over time for you and or the crew members on your pairing. It's better just to file the ground duty right away and then allow them to determine the eligibility once each crew member's pairing has finished. The other major category of ground duty is post-duty credit. This is any time past our checkout time that we are required to still be on board to maintain minimum crew. This is most often in the context of waiting for passengers who need wheelchair assistance, any transfers of unaccompanied minors, deplaning of deportees, and so on and so forth. Unlike ground service to passengers, you can claim for any amount of time you are required to remain on duty following the end of your duty day. This can be as little as 1 minute. Article 5.08 is the collective agreement reference for this. There's not a lot of language written about post-duty credit, so most of the way it works now is just based really on experience and established practice. So we do know that we can claim for any amount of time following the end of a duty day. And this is true even if you arrive early and thus your duty day checkout time is earlier, you can still file for post-duty credit if you are required to remain on duty past your adjusted checkout time. As with ground service to passengers, you can substantiate these e-claims by reporting any of the post-duty you've performed in your OBR in the category of crew feedback, the ground duty subcategory, and then in this case, I would select other. Post-duty credit is paid in addition to any DPG or THG. So DPG and THG do not negate any post-duty credit claims. You will still get post-duty credit even if there's DPG or THG. Now let's dive into a couple of advanced principles that are service director specific. The first is your duty period guarantee pay rate. As a service director, your pay rate for DPG is based on the aircraft type of the final flight that was actually operated within that duty day. So note that that would be operated, not deadhead. And there's a different reason for that we'll get into later. For now, for this example, the last flight actually operated in the duty day is what determines the rate per minute for your DPG. So if we look at this example day, that's from my schedule, I had flight 114, where I operated Toronto, and then I deadheaded home on flight 129. When looking in the flight information section of my flight summary, we can see that for flight 114, the flight I operated, that my equipment was an Airbus 330. It shows us 340 in our flight summaries, but that's the code that's used for Airbus 330. So because I operated on an Airbus 330, that means that as long as this was the last flight that I actually operated in my duty day, DPG needs to be paid at the Airbus 330 rate as well. Flight 129, I deadheaded on, I did not operate on. So the aircraft type of Flight 129 doesn't matter for the purposes of my DPG. You'll notice, in fact, if you look at the information for Flight 129, that I was on an Airbus 321 when deadheading. But that does not matter for the purpose of pay for DPG. In this case, you can see DPG, and you can see the Airbus 330 rate is being applied because the last flight I actually operated was the Airbus 330. And we can indeed see for those 78 minutes and the 281 minutes for the actual flight going to Toronto for both Index 2 and Index 3, I have been paid at the same aircraft type, that is the 767 and Airbus 330 rate. I have been paid at that rate per minute for those two index items. So this has been paid correctly. Now let's look into THG. For THG, the only minor difference for this as opposed to DPG is that it is paid based on the aircraft type of the final flight actually operated within the entire pairing. So for this particular example that I had a multi-day pairing that went from July 19th all the way to July 23rd. If we look, we can see that on my very last day, so not the 19th, not the 20th, not the 21st, on the 23rd, I had a flight 103, that went from Toronto to Vancouver. When we look in my flight information section for flight 103, I was on a 787. I have 299 minutes payable at the 777-787 single SD rate as a result of operating that leg. And we can indeed see that for those 299 minutes that I was paid at the correct rate for that flight. Now what's interesting when we look at THG is that we can see that the equipment type assigned to it is 787 as well, and that lines up with the practice in effect. Notice in Globe that we see a THG of 352. So whenever we see that, we know to look for whatever the aircraft type of the final flight in the pairing is that was actually operated, and then on that basis we know which aircraft type the THG has to be paid for. So there's 232 minutes payable in THG, and because the last leg was 787, we should be paid at that aircraft type for the THG as well. And indeed, when we look at index item 10, we can see 232 minutes, and these minutes are paid at the single SD 777-787 rate. So this has also been paid correctly. Now let's have a look at deadhead pay rate. As a service director, when we are deadheading, the rate of pay per minute is not based on the aircraft type you are actually deadheading on. If you operate after your deadhead, the pay rate in effect for your deadhead is based on the aircraft type you operate next. That's the default rule. The next aircraft type may be in your next duty day rather than your current one, assuming it's a multi-day pairing. If you do not operate after your deadhead, then the pay rate needs to be based on the aircraft type you operated before your deadhead. And again, the previous aircraft type may be in the duty day prior rather than the current one. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. In this example that I have, again, the first flight, the one that was actually operated, was flight 114. And then the flight that was deadheaded on was flight 129. We can see that flight 114, so index item 1, or 2, pardon, was on an Airbus 330, which again is shown as 340 in a flight summary, but it's for the 330. If we then look at index item 3, which corresponds to flight 129 for both DPG and ultimately for deadhead, when we look at index 4, we can see that the Airbus 330 has also been used for the deadhead pay rate. Even though, if we look in Globe, we can see that we deadheaded on an Airbus 321. We are not paid for the deadhead based on the aircraft type we're on for the deadhead. It is based on the principle of the aircraft type you operate next if there's a flight after, but in this case, because there wasn't, the pay rate is based on the aircraft type operated prior. And for this one, that was an Airbus 330. So when we look, we can see that $1.37 per minute has been used for not just the flight to Toronto that I operated, but also for the deadhead home, since the last flight that was operated was on an Airbus 330. So as a service director, when you are on reassignment, what should you be paid? There's just a slight difference. Again, this is related to aircraft type pay. So when thinking about reassignment, we usually think about the a number of minutes that are protected. And that's true. We do need to make sure that we have our credit protected on reassignment. For service directors, there is an additional variable where your total pairing pay needs to be protected. So you are pay protected for the greater of your originally scheduled total pairing pay versus your total pairing pay on reassignment. So that's something to verify. And if after doing the math, you have a different number for your reassignment pairing pay as opposed to your originally scheduled pairing pay, you would again make a pay adjustment for that. As with flight attendants, per diems for service directors are never protected, and accordingly, per diems are only issued based on what you have actually flown on reassignment. If you have any questions about your specific pay or flight summary as a service director, fa.crewpay@aircanada.ca is your official company-side resource for any of your inquiries. If you are unable to come to a resolution with crew pay regarding your entitlement to different pay claims, then you should reach out to your local union officers for any assistance, and make sure that you carbon copy pay@acomponent.ca as well. Thanks for being here today. See you next time.